It is 9:08, so we are going to get started. It's good to see so many familiar faces and some new ones. I'm Kathleen Cusack. I am the Director of Curriculum here at Econoful, if I haven't had the chance to meet you. Thank you for being here, and today I'm really excited to look at how student feedback can become a powerful and a practical tool in your professional toolkit. My hope is that you will leave here today with a structure for how to obtain and analyze student feedback so you can intentionally act on it to strengthen your instruction in the upcoming year. So these learning objectives we will return to at the end of our time together. And to achieve these objectives, we're going to start with briefly why student feedback matters, and then we will move into the practical structure that you can use right away for collecting, analyzing, and acting on student feedback. And then we'll close out with some tips and tricks that you can use in that process. We have so many more people joining. Excellent, welcome. I was too enthusiastic. That's classic for me. I was that person who would start teaching before the bell a lot, so sorry. All right, well, for those of you just joining, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. These are our learning objectives, and we are going to jump into things. So, first and foremost, I would love to hear in the Zoom chat. I know you all collect feedback informally, and you act on it throughout the day, right? You're noticing when students are engaged, you're checking on their understanding of content, but take a moment and consider your experience with formally collecting student feedback. So how useful has that process been for you? Like at the end of a lesson, formally collecting the feedback on the day, end of a unit, end of exam. So if you could put in the chat, okay, people are doing it. A for very useful, B for somewhat useful, and C for not useful. Okay. Excellent. We're getting lots of different responses. And no judgment wherever you are. I, in my own life, have felt at times it's been very useful all the way through not so useful. So I appreciate you sharing what your experience has been up until this point. As you will see today, the degree to which feedback is useful depends on a whole host of different factors. So let's start out with some of the questions that we tend to ask ourselves about our teaching. So take a moment, think of a time when you asked yourself one of these questions. You don't have to identify it in the chat. This is just a moment of quiet reflection. All right, now let's take those same questions and group them intentionally. So the questions on the left lead us to self-evaluation, and there is nothing wrong with those questions. But if our orientation is only towards them, then what we're doing is we're looking at evaluation for proficiency, like did we hit our target? Am I a good teacher? And the research tells us that teacher and student feedback that focuses on the questions on the right are more useful in helping us to actually shift our instruction towards being reflective of our own practice, seeing feedback as a formative process, and importantly, taking a student-centered approach. So these questions on the right, how can I improve? How can I develop my teaching? How well have my students learned? Those are the kinds of questions that teachers who are engaged in a growth mindset are asking themselves. And when we ask ourselves those questions on the right, we're identifying our learning goals, and we're thinking about and asking ourselves, how can we meet them? So if we want to grow as teachers, which I'm assuming you do because you're here, why should we turn to our students to help us improve our teaching? Like, they don't have an education degree, they aren't experienced instructional coaches, and there's really two arguments here that I want to emphasize. So the first is there is strong research evidence that K through 12 student evaluations and feedback of teaching are actually stronger predictors of teaching quality than formal observation conducted by a trained observer. Which, when I read that, was at first surprising when I was reading that research. But then when I thought about it, I was like, my students see me every day And my observers see me, maybe 3 times a semester. So it's not really that surprising. And I think also we intuitively know that like students are experts on their own experience, right? They know when things are clicking, and likewise, they know when they are struggling with things. And then, second, maybe more importantly, depending on how you look at things, students who have a strong sense of belonging in their classroom have better outcomes, both academically, socially, and emotionally. So when we are sincerely asking students their opinions about how we can be better teachers, and we're acting on their feedback, and then we're sharing how their feedback is helping us learn to be better at our jobs, we're creating a space where students feel like they belong. And because you chose to be here today, I'm assuming that most of you already see the value in gathering student feedback. So I want to spend more time on the practical components than on the research. But if you are really excited to dig into that research more, I have included resources in the slides, which we'll share with you later today so that you have access to that. Oh, yeah. Okay. So how do we do this work? How do we actually collect the student feedback and then use it to shift our instruction? I think it's helpful to think about the work as a cycle of collecting the feedback, right? That's going to be the gathering information from students and then analyzing the data that we collect. That's what can I learn from my students? And then, of course, we want to take action based on our analysis. So what changes can I make to better support my students? And then, of course, it's time to wonder, did that change in practice support students? And so we'll start that cycle over again. And then each time you're moving through this cycle, you're building a stronger and a more responsive classroom. So for that cycle to be meaningful, we've got to tailor it to the purpose, which means we need to identify a goal. So we can identify our goal or our focus based on something that's important to us. Otherwise, why are we spending time focused on it, right? So we want to pick something that matters and it's something we're willing to make a change to. If we're not willing to make a change, then we're not going to be able to go through the act portion of the cycle. So for example, maybe it's really important to you to support student mastery of a specific topic or concept, and you're willing to change how you teach that topic or concept. Maybe you want to look at aligning your instruction to the assessment expectations, and you're willing to change your instruction in preparation for that assessment. Or maybe you just want to look at your instructional supports and determine whether or not they're sufficient for students. Once you've got your goal, then you need to think about the reality of life. What is your capacity to collect and to analyze feedback, right? How much time and energy do you have to devote to it? No judgment there, but it's just important to be realistic with yourself so that you are collecting an amount of data that's manageable, and then you're acting on that data in a way that is manageable. I would say probably redoing your entire semester mid-semester is probably not manageable for most of us. So once you know your goal and your capacity, then you can begin the cycle. And for me, it's really helpful to look at a concrete example. So Megan was generous enough. She taught a community college course last fall. It was an intro to microeconomics. And she identified supporting mastery of supply and demand as her purpose. That was one of the course learning objectives. So it was important to her that her students were able to master that. And she was willing to make changes about how she taught those topics. So she created an open-ended form for her students. She did see this class once a week, which I know for high school educators, that's not your norm. So she saw her kiddos once a week, and she had 18 students. So that gave her a bit more capacity to be collecting and analyzing data at the end of every class period. And it allowed her to collect and analyze open-ended responses, which I'll show you here in a moment. Importantly, Megan decided to administer this form during class time. So one reason for that is she found when there were other feedback opportunities assigned for homework, very few students completed it. So she shifted to doing it in class, and then that sent a really clear message to her students. This is important enough for me to give up instruction minutes with you. I really value your input, so we're going to spend some of our time together doing this work. And then during that collection process, you can see the form that she used. It's very short. She did collect student names, and that allowed her to follow up with individual students as needed. And then she addressed common confusions and misconceptions with the whole class. And I'll show you that in just a moment. Collecting data anonymously might make more sense in other contexts. Just it's going to depend upon what your purpose is. So in case it's hard for you to see, the questions she asked were, what was the most important thing you learned in today's class? What was most confusing or unclear? And then what concepts would you like to feel more confident about? And those last two questions are really two different ways of asking the same things. Like what, from a student's perspective, what do they need more help with? So she has her data, she's ready to analyze it. Megan has generously shared this with us. So I would like you to take a moment to look over her students' feedback. And then in the chat, what patterns do you see? So these are all the responses to what was unclear or confusing from today's class. Thank you, Craig. Okay. Supply. I know typing, it definitely takes time. I have to work on my virtual wait time. Excellent. Yeah. I love that you pulled that out, Peggy. Some about shifts and some about personal needs, some recognition of things students need to be doing differently. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we're in agreement here. Like there's a lot to parse through. But after Megan analyzed the feedback, she noticed the patterns that you all noticed as well. Concepts related to surplus and shortage in supply were most confusing for students. So now that she knows what the general confusions were, it's time for her to act. So she adjusted the plan for her very next time that she saw these students. And she started that class off by sharing this slide. So at the very front of the class, she says, here's what I heard from you. This is what you were confident about, shifting to the demand curve. And here's what you're not feeling so great about. And so as a result of what I heard from you, here's what we're going to do today in class. We're going to do some more practice so that you can distinguish between shifts of supply and demand. And then we're going to watch a short video to reinforce the difference between shortage and surplus. I'm not going to show you the video clip just because it's not the best use of our time, but I do want to show you the additional practice that she supplied her students with. So she asked her students to think about these different scenarios and identify which of them would result in a shift in the supply curve. I'm not going to quiz you all. If you would like to identify which of these you think would shift the supply for the peanut butter market, you're welcome to. But Megan then debriefed this with her students. So they're getting some real in-class practice and some reinforcement on why these different things would shift the supply curve. And then she sums up the key content here for students. And from what she said, her experience during this class period is that her students were much more involved in this activator because it was directly linked to the things that they said they needed help with. So she had buy-in right from the get-go because she said, here's what you all told me you needed help with, so we're going to do something to help you with that. I want to take a look at another example, and this one is from our Econoful curriculum project that we did last fall. So I'll give you just a little bit of context if you are not up to speed on what we were doing. We were in a local Tucson high school and we field tested our one semester on level high school econ curriculum in 6 different sections. So we collected a lot of data from that process, and part of it was hosting a student focus group at the end of Unit 2, which for us is microeconomics. And we had our students come in on a late start Friday before school. So this was a self-selecting group. And we had the capacity to allocate this time before school because this was the bulk of my work last fall was doing this. If I was a classroom teacher, I don't know if I would have had the time to run this data collection in the same way. But these are two of the questions that we posed to our student focus group. What was most or least helpful? What would you keep or change? So I was asking the students these questions, and then Megan was very kindly transcribing the process or the responses. So we had all of their thoughts on this. And now that we had our data, the transcript of the student responses, we were ready to analyze it. And I'm going to show you some of that feedback that we received. When you take a look at the feedback, you'll see student names. Those are just made up names, so don't worry. Their data has been protected. But once we put that in the chat, I'll give you a moment to just read it over. And we're going to do that same process we did with Megan's students' responses. So what patterns do you notice? How might you interpret that? So if you could click on the link that Mikkel just popped in the chat, and I'll give you a moment, and I'm going to put it up on my screen as well here momentarily. What patterns do you notice? How might you interpret that feedback? Okay, good. I see people are in there. Okay, I see some people's responses are coming in. If you don't get a chance to read every word that they spoke, it is okay. But if you could take a step back and think about what patterns are you seeing and how might we interpret that? Okay. Scaffolded note taking, notes, asking for it to be more interactive, want more than just sitting and listening, want to manipulate or work with materials. Okay. Oh my gosh. Could have used you all when I was doing this. This is so great. Wonderful. Okay, so let me zoom out. Amazing. And I'm going to go over to the analysis piece. So thank you for sharing what you noticed. When we went back through this transcript, just like you all did, we ended up coding it in 3 different ways. And you've identified all 3 of these pieces. So this should not come as a surprise. But in green, you can see here every time a student mentioned fill in the blank notes or note taking more generally. In blue, we have mentions of need for active learning. And then in yellow, we have things that students said they just did not find helpful. So let's look at what we made out of those patterns. So I'm going to go back to my slides, I hope. Hopefully that worked and you can see my slides now. All right, so first off, I want to be transparent with you all. We could have been defensive here. My whole job is writing this curriculum, and I wrote it using backward design. So I could have said, look, these lessons were designed to build towards the assessment. If students are telling me that they're struggling, like that's on them. They must be doing something wrong. But if that's my approach, then why am I asking them for their opinions? So instead, we said, what's the broader issue here that students are trying to solve when they're telling us that they're struggling with definitions and note taking, right? The green highlights showed students were very clearly asking for fill in the blank notes. But then the yellow highlights told us why they were asking for it. Students were saying things like, just having the definitions on the handout doesn't help me. And just reading something doesn't ingrain the material. And then the blue highlighted portions showed that students were pointing to what does help. Moving, talking with a partner, working through a scenario. So putting all that together, students weren't really asking for an easier note format. They were telling us that passive review was not preparing them to apply the content. And our summative assessments require applying vocabulary, concepts, and models to novel scenarios. So that gap is what led us to say students felt unprepared for the assessment. And we need to do something about that, right? We need to take some action to change that. Side note, if you're interested in learning more about summative assessments, Megan will have a workshop on that in the afternoon. All right, so here's what we did. In response to that feedback and our meaning making, we decided to create some more explicit opportunities for students to actively engage with the content and the vocab, not just receive it. So we created word walls with the key vocabulary for each unit. You can see an example of some of the terms that showed up on our word wall for Unit 3, and then teachers hung those up in the classroom. And that gave students access to that content-specific vocabulary. And then teachers were able to encourage students to extend their initial responses. Like when they were talking in partnerships, when they were sharing out the class, the teacher could point to that word wall and say, like, all right, let's pause. What terms would an economist use in their response? So now students are having to practice applying those terms. So it's not about just memorizing a definition, it's can you apply them to what we're discussing? And then we also created a sentence starter for one lesson so that students could take on an active role of like trying on this discipline-specific language. So I want to show you what the sentence starter structure looked like, which is a tongue twister. In lesson 4.2, you may be familiar with it. That's where students are in pairs and they get playing cards, either hearts, diamonds, or clubs. And those different countries have different sets of rules. And so through this simulation, they're internalizing the connection between effective institutions and a higher standard of living. And our initial structure for the debrief of that activity was asking students, how might the rules of the game in your country affect the standard of living? That's a pretty meaty question. So we changed that based on what we heard from the students. And now they were addressing that same prompt, but instead of using just a general question, they had the sentence starter structure to help give them an entryway into incorporating economic vocabulary. So same structure that they were asking for with fill in the blank notes, but instead of copying down a missing term during a lecture, they're actively using the language of econ to explain their experience. You've just seen two ways that we've collected feedback, right? There was the short form exit ticket with some open-ended questions from Megan, and then there was our focus group that also had open-ended questions. There are lots of different ways that you can go about collecting feedback. So take a moment to scan some of the other ways you might go about doing this. And Likert scale might be a term you're not familiar with, but I promise you're familiar with it. A Likert scale is just a survey tool to measure attitudes or opinions where you're rating how much you agree or disagree with a statement. So like, this professional development session was useful. 1, strongly disagree. 5, strongly agree. That's a Likert scale. All right, so what should you keep in mind as you try this yourself? First, before you collect any data, think about whether or not what you're collecting is going to help you know what changes you can make to improve your instruction and then better support your students. So say you want to know what would help students feel prepared for an assessment. You could consider adding a question to the end of the summative, and you can either ask them, how fair was this assessment? Very, somewhat, not fair. Or you could say, what would help you feel more prepared for the assessment? Nothing, more practice, better understanding of the content, or something else. So still multiple choice, but now we have an open-ended option. And in the chat, tell me which of these you think sets you up for action. Which prompt is going to help you know what you can do? And the second one, I meant to show you there's an A and a B, but this is excellent. You figured it out. Okay, wonderful. Even though I tried to sabotage you, you were on top of it. Absolutely. So how fair sits on the evaluation side. It tells us if you hit the target. It does not tell us what to change. Knowing 50% of your students don't think the assessment was fair, okay, so what am I going to do in the future, right? But if you know 50% of your students say they would benefit from more practice, then that's something that you can do in the next unit so that you can move the needle on that feedback. And then how you frame the ask matters in some ways just as much as what it is that you're asking. You'll remember that Megan gave up class time to ask for feedback instead of assigning it as homework, right? She learned that lesson, and that told students, this matters enough that I'm not squeezing it into your time. So small choices like that can really shape the quality of the feedback that you get. And I want to show you another example of that, and you'll have access to this sample short end of unit survey. So this is like the supply and demand feedback that we saw from Megan. It's framed with a growth mindset model, right? So it's communicating just how valuable this teacher finds the feedback. At the start, it says, your teacher is always learning, just like you. We give our students a ton of feedback in the classroom. So starting to take their feedback in and then use that to improve your instruction really sets up this excellent relationship where it's like, I'm going to give you feedback so you can improve. You're going to give me feedback so I can improve. And, you know, as a group, we're all going to leave here better off than when we started. And then it continues on with what's one thing I could change or do differently as a teacher to help you better learn in the next unit. And thank you for helping me better support you. That kind of phrasing is saying, I, as a teacher, am taking responsibility to improve, and I'm here to help you. Like, that's my end goal here, is for you to be successful. So that covers some of those collection phase tips. Let's shift into what do we do when we get all this data back? First off, I encourage you to be curious. Ask yourself, like, how can my students' feedback help me understand what they need to learn? How can I use their feedback to be a more effective teacher? And if you find yourself feeling defensive when you read your students' feedback, like that's so normal. That's so relatable. If you find yourself shifting to the left side of the spectrum and you start thinking like, am I a good teacher? Am I doing a good job? That's a really good signal for you that it's time to pause. You're feeling a lot of feelings, so it's time to take a break, maybe have a snack, take a walk, and then come back to this when you can be curious again. Because if you're just going to say, you guys don't know what you're talking about, you're wrong, well, then this whole exercise in collecting feedback is not a great use of anyone's time. So we're going to assume that you're curious and you're not hungry. So you're ready to review the data. We're going to look for patterns. And that's something you've all had some practice doing. And the human brain is really excellent at finding patterns. And you all were on it when we looked at those examples. In multiple choice and Likert scale questions, pattern finding can be really easy to spot. When analyzing open-ended questions, it might not be as obvious. So like when you start looking for responses, think about, am I seeing the same words a lot, like fill in the blank? Or are they expressing a similar emotional response, like frustration? It takes more time for sure when you're doing open-ended responses. So that's something to keep in mind of before you collect the data. How are you going to go about analyzing it? Do you have the time to analyze it? And then it's important when you're looking for patterns to also take a step back and pay attention to outliers too, especially if you can identify who that feedback is coming from. Right? In our classrooms, of course, we want all students to be successful. So if there are a few students who are having a wildly different experience from their peers, what's maybe accounting for that? How can we explain it? And then what can we do differently to get those students kind of back with their peers and not having those outlier experiences? And then When analyzing the data, you definitely are going to have to use your professional judgment to make meaning of those patterns. So this is the step that we just walked through with our student feedback group. Noticing the fill in the blank requests alongside the mentions of movement and conversation. It took our judgment to read those together as students are asking for more active practice. They're not really just saying, give us easier notes. Like that's what they're saying to our faces, but that's not really what they're trying to solve. Sometimes students propose a solution, and that's something to be on the lookout for. So our job is to see the forest, not just the trees, going beyond those literal wordings of any one comment or any one kind of theme, and then digging into what is it that they're trying to tell us. And as you saw from that student feedback focus group, sometimes data analysis can be labor intensive. Like that whole highlighting process, I'm not going to lie to you, that took quite a bit of effort and energy for my brain. Especially this is the case when it comes to open-ended responses. So I would encourage you to consider a tool like AI using something like a large language model, Claude, ChatGPT. That can be really helpful in identifying themes, particularly highlighting frequently mentioned strengths or concerns, and then sorting that feedback into categories. So it definitely doesn't replace your professional judgment, but it can make the initial sorting and pattern finding much more efficient. Northeastern University put together a resource with some example prompts. So if you're not familiar with using large language models or using them in this way, these are some great examples. They're geared towards a college classroom. So we have adapted them for a high school context. Both are going to be shared in the resources from today. So you can take those and then tweak them to your particular circumstances. And then another excellent opportunity here is to lean on your colleagues. So if you have a colleague that you trust and whose insight you respect and you value, then bring them in, especially if you're feeling defensive. Having somebody else look through that data and say, here are the patterns I noticed, means you don't have to look at every single comment, and then you're not up at 2 a.m. fixated on the one comment that really stuck in your heart. Not that that's ever happened, right? So lean on these tools when you are analyzing the feedback. And then it's time to act. But be kind to yourself. Start really small. Pick one thing to try. Pick one thing to change. Think of this as like you're tinkering. You're not trying to overhaul your entire course. You're not acting on every single thing you heard. So for example, with the student focus group, we did the sentence starters for one lesson because truthfully, that was the capacity that I had at the time to create that and then integrate it. So start off small, then you'll have a small win that you can build on. And then whatever it is that you decide to act on, tell your students. Name what you heard from them and tell them, this is what I'm changing as a result. And then just as importantly, this is what I'm not changing. And here's why I'm not changing it. So we had that conversation with the students who told us about the fill in the blanks. We said, we know you were asking for fill in the blanks. We're not going to give you fill in the blank notes. Here's what we're going to do instead. And they're like, okay, cool. I'll give that a try, right? If you're transparent with them, they often meet you halfway. And that transparency is going to turn the feedback process into this ongoing conversation instead of a one-time survey. And the transparency is really important because then the next time you ask for feedback, they're going to give you more quality feedback, right? No one likes filling out a survey and then coming to work on a Monday and having like the things you said you really hated be exactly the same. So, treat your students the way you want to be treated when like you fill out a district survey, for example. Okay, let's bring it together. We have talked about approaching feedback with an improvement mindset. We've walked through how to collect it, how to analyze it, how to act on it. Now I want you to think about what's sticking with you. What is your biggest takeaway from today? And I'm going to ask that you share that in the chat. I like that too, Kelsey. Thank you. Okay, yes, you'll get access, Richard, to that Google form. Wonderful, thank you. Transparency, so important. Thanks, Sarah. Also, hello. And Alicia, two former Econoful ambassadors back to back. Oh, I love that. Be humble. Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Oh, this. I'm going to have to go through these more with a fine tooth comb later. I really appreciate your reflection and sharing that with your colleagues. All right. I want to make sure that while this is fresh in your mind, you have some time to consider how you might go about this approach in the upcoming school year. So Mikkel's going to put a link to the planning document in the chat. I'm going to have you open that up and you can make a copy of it, or it should prompt you to make a copy of it. If that's not working for you, I'm also going to share it on my screen here in a moment. And start out with your goal, right? So think about what is it that you are interested in and willing to make a change to. And feel free to start small. Thinking about like, I want to change, my students mastering supply and demand, and I'm willing to change how I teach that. And then decide how you're going to go about collecting feedback. What makes the most sense for your particular context? Is it open-ended? Is it multiple choice? And then what kind of prompt or prompts can you use? And let's think about, are these prompts leading me towards action? So how we phrase them is really going to be important. And then you also might want to consider whether using AI or a trusted colleague is going to be helpful in analyzing those results. So I see some people already in here. Excellent. I'll put that up on the screen. If it's more useful for you to do some more digging and you'd rather take a look at the resources, you can click on that link and that'll take you to resources that you'll get formally in just a little bit. So I'm going to be quiet for about 3 minutes and give you some time to think about this. If and when questions come up for you, please add them to the chat, because if you have a question, probably somebody else does too. All right, I got through most of the chat and I saw a pattern of you all seem, well, not you all, but the pattern was appreciating the transparency. That was a big takeaway for a lot of you, as well as making sure that the feedback that you are collecting is actionable. And if you're an outlier, that's great too. So I don't mean to have you feel left out. All right, so I want to make sure that we get things wrapped up so that you have plenty of time in the next couple portions of today.